Dynamics in an aging labor market. Okay, so this is the motivation. This is plotting for the US the share of the labor force that is 40 years and older over the past 35 or so years. Okay, so over this period, the US has gotten a lot older. Okay, so this is an increase of something like 15 percentage points in the share of the labor force that is 40 years and older. Okay? Over the same period, we've seen broad-based declines in a range of measures of dynamism of the US labor market. Okay, so this is plotting a couple of measures. This is in dark blue firm turnover. That's the sum of entry and exit of firms. It's plotting in this royal blue the employment, unemployment mobility rate of workers. And finally in pink here, the job-to-job mobility rate. And as we heard in some other presentation, you know, we can only go back to 94 for that hazard rate in the CPS. But across the board, this paints a picture of kind of broad-based declines in dynamism of the US labor market over this period.
EDU means moving from employment into unemployment.
Yes, this is from employment to unemployment. I'll show you the reverse in
I was wondering why that going down is less dynamism.
Oh, true. Okay, maybe the terminology is wrong, but there is less kind of mobility, if you like. People are moving between employment states less than in the past. That's all I want to kind of make out of this. Yep. Okay? Okay, so this is the motivation. I should also mention here that on the worker side at least, we can do a direct type of accounting exercise to get a sense of this aging, how much of that kind of can just account for the declines in the worker mobility rates. We know that older workers are less mobile than younger workers. Okay? If you do that, and people have done that in the literature, it turns out that just from an accounting perspective, what people typically call the direct effect of aging only accounts for a fraction of these declines. Okay? So all I'm saying is we need something more than just a pure accounting exercise, some type of equilibrium effect.
Can you say more about what the fraction is?
Yeah, so it's about you can get it for some of these hazard rates up to say 30% explained by that. So non-trivial for sure, but far still from the majority of the declines we've seen. Okay? Great. So in this paper then, I'm going to try to get a sense of what the equilibrium effects of aging are, and I'm going to try to do that in two ways. First, I'm going to do a reduced form empirical assessment. That's going to be very fast today. I'm going to exploit predictable variation in aging across US states over this period. Okay. Very fast, yes. And I'm going to find that aging, no, you'll see a few more slides on this, okay, so I'll show you a little bit more on it later, but aging predicts based on those regressions about between 40 and 50% of the declines that we've seen. Okay, so more, substantially more than just pure direct effect. Again, indicating some type of equilibrium effects of aging. Okay, and it's also going to turn out that aging is negatively correlated with economic growth across states. Okay. Secondly, I'm going to do a structural assessment. I'm going to develop a theory that links firm dynamics, worker dynamics, and economic growth to the age composition of the labor force. I'm going to use that theory to do a structural assessment of the impact of aging on the US economy over this period, and I'm going to come up with a number that is similar to what the cross-state variation says. Again, the structural theory will suggest that aging of the same magnitude as we've seen in the US explains between 40 and 50% of the declines that we've seen in these various measures of dynamism. So both on the firm side and on the worker side. And finally, it's also going to suggest that aging has reduced annual economic growth by about 1/4 percentage point. Okay? And again, let me just hammer in that half of these approximately are due to equilibrium forces in the model. Okay, great. So that's where I'm going. Let me quickly, yep.
Give us a sense of what are those forces?
For sure, I'll spend a couple of slides of them later, but a key force here is going to be that mismatch, what I term labor market mismatch, is going to interact in a two-way sense with incentives to innovate. Or in particular here, incentives to innovate are going to be entering as an entrepreneur, starting new businesses. So a kind of Schumpeterian idea of innovation. So those two forces are going to interact in the sense that if more people enter entrepreneurship and drive up economic growth, growth is going to be creative destructive in my model. And that's going to lead to more mismatch in the labor market. When there is more mismatch in the labor market, that's a good time to innovate, okay? Because it's cheap to hire workers that are mismatched, and it's relatively not that costly to attempt entrepreneurship because you're on average not that well matched in the labor market. So that's going to be the key equilibrium force in the model. But we'll come to that later, okay? So let me quickly first show you some of the cross-state variation. I'm going to construct a data set at the state year level from 1978 to 2014 on various measures of dynamism and the age composition of a state. I'm going to, in that data set, regress these various measures of dynamism here in Y. So think of this, for instance, as the firm entry rate, okay, on a measure of the age composition of the state, which again, for me, is going to be the share of the labor force or of the working age population. That is.
People are migrating out because the state is screwed.
Yeah. So that's a great point. Let me talk about that on the next slide. Okay, so this is the regression we're going to run. The share that is older in that state, controlling for state fixed effects and year effects and potentially some time varying covariates. Okay, standard errors two-way clustered. Of course. Okay, let me, before I get into that, just show you what the identifying variation is. This is just plotting for 4 states. That share, again, that is older. And as you can see, sort of all states here, all these 4 states, in fact, all US states saw an increase in the share of this period, but both how much it increased and when it increased differs kind of meaningfully across states. And that's the variation I'm going to exploit. But of course, as Victor said, there is a concern that there is mobility across states that is endogenous to dynamism. Okay, so that's a concern. Let me first kind of quickly say that the concern is a little bit more subtle than, say, old people always moving to Florida, okay, because I have state fixed effects there. So it's a little bit more subtle. In particular, the concern is that Pennsylvania sees a temporary increase in dynamism, and young people disproportionately move into Pennsylvania when they see that increase. Okay, so that's the real concern. It's a little bit more subtle, but certainly it's still relevant. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to instrument for the current age composition in 2 ways. Either I'm going to go back 10 years in time, take the age composition then, or I'm going to go back even further in time. I'm going to take the birth rate in that state 40 to 64 years earlier to instrument for the current age composition. Okay. Okay, so let me quickly just show you the results. These are a lot of numbers. I don't want you to focus on every single number, but rather just see that across the board here for establishment dynamics and firm dynamics, regardless of whether we use the labor force or the working age population, and whether we instrument or not with these 2 instruments, across the board, these are negative and strongly statistically significant with these 2-way cluster standard errors, indicating that as a state gets older, it sees declines in various measures of establishment dynamics and firm dynamics. On the worker side, something similar, although it's a little bit in general less precise, partly I think just because this is based on the CPS survey data. Once you start cutting it into age bins in a year in a state, some states are small, but still kind of some patterns emerge, and in particular it looks like the employment to unemployment rate and the job to job mobility rate is negatively correlated with the share of older, but there is much less evidence for the unemployment to employment hazard rate. And for the growth rate, again, this negative correlation between aging and economic growth. Yeah, Matt?
So this is all within state, right? Like with a fixed effect? So
yeah.
I'm surprised that there's even enough within state variation over like this time span in like working age population.
Yeah.
Oh, it's this? Okay.
This is that share. Of course, in the IVs, it's a little bit, I mean, you need to project it on there. But yeah, there is quite a lot of variation across US states.
How do you think about the IV giving you a bigger coefficient and magnitude than the
Yeah.
OX? Because usually you would, if you're worried about endogeneity like Victor, you'd think that should attenuate it.
Yeah. That's a good point. So this is kind of, I mean, this part is in some sense reminiscent at least of Scheimer's 2001 paper, where he kind of studies something similar, but only for the unemployment rate. There he finds again a little bit larger effects, and I talked to some labor economists running similar type of regressions, and they also seem to find a little bit larger coefficients. One interpretation that they give is that there's measurement error in this, and then the IV can actually improve or like give a larger estimate. In that case, that's the typical interpretation of this. But
that's the stand-in anytime IV is bigger than exactly. catch-all.
Yeah.
It's hard to falsify.
Right.
Something will always be true.
Yeah, but okay, let me, so people have thought about that, but yeah, it's a good point. So finally, let me just show you, just to give you a sense of how large these estimates are, let me take the estimates and feed in the aging we've seen in the US over this period. Okay, so to predict the impact of aging based on that cross-sectional elasticity. Okay? And this is what you get. The turnover rate, this is in red, the predicted effect. In dashed blue is the actual rate we've seen, HP filtered here. You can see that cross-state variation picks up quite a lot of this decline we've seen in the turnover rate. The same for the entry rate of firms, the employment-unemployment mobility hazard. This is kind of nice too, because this is one of the few things we can go back further in time. Using BLS data, we can go back to 1948, and we see this kind of generally, this kind of secular increase in this hazard rate when the US got younger, or period when the US got younger, and then we've seen this kind of big decline after. And the cross-state regressions, again, pick up quite a lot of that variation we've seen over time. And finally, for the unemployment-to-employment mobility rate, we don't see much of a secular decline in this hazard rate. There's obviously a big drop. We know from, again, Scheimer's work that this is highly cyclical. If I extended this until now using recent data, it's actually almost recovered now. So it's pretty much back somewhere here. So both in the cross-state variation and over time in the US, there is not much evidence of a decline or a correlation between this and aging. Okay?
But then it means like if you stop at 2006 or 7, it explains 100%, no? It's just the last bit that we're missing.
Sure. You mean here?
I mean the top. So.
Oh yeah, yeah, true. I mean, for sure, it looks like sort of this series has declined more. I mean, it certainly started before the Great Recession. In the theory too, I'm not going to claim that I explain all of the changes we've seen in the US with aging. So, you know, I don't dispute that other forces are at work here, both from the cross-state variation and also from the structural perspective. So, you know, certainly I think some other forces are at work here too. Okay.
Entry rate is it firms or establishments or?
This particular one is establishments, employment weighted, but it turns out that this is very robust if I use the firm. So you saw the coefficient here at least for firms. This is for firms. I actually only have the employment weighted, but it also holds for the employment unweighted rate too. So it's kind of very robust. This particular one I plotted is the establishment employment weighted has entry rate. Okay, so
something about where this aging comes from in the sense of which population groups maybe are the ones responsible for that? If you think about like immigration trends or something over time, is that partly capturing that? Just in the sense of knowing something about the composition of the labor forces?
Yeah, so a lot of this is driven by the baby boom in the past. Okay, so there was a huge spike in fertility in the U.S. In sort of the 50s, and that's driving a lot of this variation. Okay, great. So with that, let me jump into the theory here. I'm going to develop a theory that has three key...
Is there something you can tell us about whether there is more action than the mechanic of aging? I thought you have a theory where aging is somehow amplified. Amplifies, if new interactions amplify the mechanics of the thing of aging. I've seen nothing that you have shown that there is just purely accounting from putting fixed rates and accounting things to insufficiently get actions. Is there any evidence of that?
Right, so that was my answer partly to David, but it was a little bit muted. On the worker side, we can do that kind of accounting decomposition of the direct effect of aging. If I were to show that here, that would account for only about a third of this variation you see here in the employment-unemployment rate. I can't really do it on the firm side because I can't assign an age to the firm, an age of the worker. But yeah, it's far from all of this variation we're seeing here. Okay, great.
It's unclear how you measure that, right? So how you measure the success in this variation? I mean, if I put the orange line just one point below, it looks like captures the thing very well. But what is it? What is the metric
For success here?
Yeah. So
all I want...
40%, or you mean 40%? The first one, the last one, an average of all of them?
Yeah. all I want you to kind of take away here is that aging looks like it accounts for a fair amount of the variation. Then kind of that exact number, I put one exact number, and I agree with you, if we stopped it a little bit earlier, it could be a little bit, you know. Okay, great. So let me jump into the theory. So it's going to have three key ingredients. The first is going to be a job ladder. So we've heard about that kind of before here. An idea that individuals over time climb to better firms through job-to-job mobility. Okay. The second is going to be an entrepreneurial choice. And finally, creative destruction. Okay, so this idea, going back to Schumpeter, that entry of new firms pushes out some of the least productive firms in the economy, and that drives economic growth. Okay, so let's jump into it. There's going to be a unit mass of individuals in my economy. They're going to be characterized by an age. Individuals enter as age 1. They move to the next age group at some rate kappa A. Once you reach the oldest age group, you die at some rate kappa big A. So this is just a kind of overlapping generations, perpetual youth style model, but a little bit more sophisticated, so a couple of age groups. Okay, so you age stochastically, and finally you die and you replace. I'm going to assume that individuals are perfectly altruistic with respect to their offspring. Okay? So we can just think about this economy as populated by unit continuum of dynasties. Okay? So it's just this unit mass of dynasties out there. They value an expected stream of consumption discounted at some rate rho tilde, and they enjoy some flow value of leisure when they're unemployed. Okay? So that's demographics and preferences. Let me tell you about firms. There's going to be multi-worker firms in this economy. Oh, a dynasty here just kind of lives forever but dies at some rate and are. Yeah, so essentially it helps me determine the interest rate by having that. Otherwise, it would be a little bit more complicated for me to pin it down, because you also have to take into account the fact that you might die at some point. Okay, so with the dynasty, you care perfectly about your kids, so determining the interest rate is going to be very simple. So that's the only reason for that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's going to be multi-worker firms. Okay. They're going to be characterized by productivity Z that evolves according to a Brownian motion. Okay. It has some drift and some intensity of shock, sigma. Production is going to take place at the match level, okay, because of constant returns. So I'm going to assume that there's constant returns following Jeremy's work. So we can think about kind of production at the match level here. That output produced by the match is a function of the productivity of the firm, Z. So this is in logs, so the exponential of Z times some match quality, okay, X. That match quality, I assume, starts out normalized to 1. It jumps up or down at some rate. Okay? The only purpose of having that match quality, it's quantitatively not going to be, turns out, not that important, but I want to have it just because in the data, worker flows are much larger than job flows. Okay? This is going to be a way for me to generate that. That matches are sometimes going to endogenously terminate because they receive a bad match productivity shock, and that's going to generate worker flows that are much larger than job flows, which is kind of what we see in the data. Okay. So that's the purpose of that, but quantitatively it's going to turn out that it's actually not important. Okay, there's going to be two sources of growth in my economy. One is an exogenous force. Okay. Incumbent firms grow at some rate mu O. Then there's this endogenous growth rate that comes from selection of firms, entry and exit of firms. Okay. That's going to lead to an overall growth rate of the economy that is mu E, growth rate of incumbents, this exogenous growth rate, plus this endogenous growth rate mu. Okay? Okay, great. Following the literature, I'm going to study a transformed economy. Okay, I'm going to transform everything against the lowest productivity in the market at time t. Okay, because this economy is not stationary, it grows over time. I'm going to transform it as a typical in the literature to render it stationary, and I'm henceforth going to study this stationary economy. Okay? In the stationary economy, incumbent firms, they fall behind at what the literature typically calls a rate of obsolescence. So the difference between the overall growth rate of the economy and the growth rate of incumbent firms. Okay? So the economy moves along, but incumbent firms don't grow as fast as the overall economy. So in a relative sense, they gradually fall behind until at some point they hit an endogenous exit threshold and they exit. Okay? Okay, good. So for the workers have a job finding rate lambda both from unemployment and employment. They also have, as I mentioned, they're going to have this opportunity to potentially be an entrepreneur. Okay? That arrives at some rate gamma. Associated with that is an entry cost that are allowed to differ by age. Okay? And you make a choice whether to become an entrepreneur or not. If you do that, you have to quit your job if you're employed. You draw an initial productivity from some innovation distribution, phi. Okay? And then finally, I'm going to assume that you sell this idea you had to a mutual fund and you immediately return to the labor market as unemployed. Okay? So that's clearly a simplifying assumption. The idea here is going back to Romer's 1990 paper, having this mutual fund is going to avoid the age of the founder as a state in this problem. So it's just going to simplify the problem. Okay? I'll talk a little bit more about this in one or two slides again. Okay, and then wage setting is just off the shelf, Cahoot, Postel-Vinay, and Robin's 2006 kind of offer matching framework. Okay?
So an alternative would be you still do the mutual fund, but you can be employed somehow by the...
Yeah, so this is kind of the same as actually having the entrepreneur kind of bequeath it to his offspring in some sense. In what sense?
It says that you make all these assumptions that mechanically would kill you. That entrepreneur is good to be young, only the duration of employment, and all those things that you want to get. You are building it there. So
you mean this also?
So what is it that the equilibrium going to do?
Yeah. So there is going to be an equilibrium endogenous effect. So hopefully I'll kind of show you more on that in one or two slides. So kind of...
You're keeping us in suspense a long time. Now the C, that you're intentionally hardwiring that in. You're saying that's almost like the accounting you did before.
Yes, exactly.
So later we're going to see some
equilibrium effects.
Okay.
Exactly.
So
Okay,
you had the entry by age down there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So let me move on. So I actually get it. Yeah. We can talk about that later. Yeah. So this is going to be kind of going to give me that, and I'm going to match that direct effect of aging precisely, exactly because of that. But then what I really want to think about are the potential equilibrium effects of aging. So that's really what I'm going to be focused on, and I'll give you a number for how big those equilibrium effects are.
But I think the audience doesn't want the number, they would want to know what it is. Yeah. You haven't kind of told us.
Oh, that was my answer to Victor's question initially, that when entry slows down, creative destruction is lower, and that means that the labor market becomes better matched, which endogenously is going to reduce incentives to enter even more. Okay, so that's the equilibrium effect here. Yeah, and we'll get to that in one.
Entry by age, like at a point in time, or it's constant over time.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the equilibrium.
I'm going to match it at a point in time, and I don't have the data to go back in time to see whether it's potentially changed over time. But there is other evidence across countries. Lazier has evidence across countries where he finds across countries that older countries have a shift down in this entrepreneurship entry profile over time across countries. Yep.
It looks that you're building this so that what has changed is the value of the average job to an employment. And that uses all these guys not to innovate.
Yes, exactly.
So, and you're highlighting that.
No. That's not true.
It's fine. I don't think it's an offensive way of doing it. But is it true that you can have evidence out there that it is indeed the capital value of a job relative to no job of older people is much higher because of it?
Yeah, so that's probably hard to get. First, I don't think it's hardwired because it rises endogenously. People in some sense have a longer time to climb a job ladder when growth is lower because they're not in some sense thrown out of matches as fast as before. And growth here is endogenous, so it is really an endogenous mechanism. But
the fact that the key cost of opening a firm is not resources, is the option of staying in your old job and that's essentially what you're calling hardwiring.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Let's say that to do that, which is fine.
Yeah.
You should give us some evidence that that's really going on, and that's a deterrent that you can claim that it's there.
Yeah, that's
bigger.
It's a good point. I don't have that exact evidence. I'm going to use the structure of the model to show you other moments that the model matches up with, and I'm going to through that, hopefully try to convince you that it's a good model. But yeah, it's a good point. Okay, so let me show you quickly a value function here so you get a sense of how this economy works. This is the value of a match between a firm with productivity Z when that match quality is unknown and the worker has age A. Okay? So what's happening, the match is producing some output Y, then it drifts down in this normalized economy at some endogenous rate mu, right? It falls behind the market over time because a match is tied to incumbent firms and incumbent firms drift behind. Okay? It is hit by some shocks, okay, so that's all standard. The individual ages at some rate kappa, that match quality is revealed at some rate psi. That's just to, again, generate these worker flows that are larger than job flows. You receive a job offer, okay, as a worker, and you move if that offers a higher value than what you have right now. And finally, you get these entrepreneurship opportunities. And you, again, make an optimizing choice of whether to become an entrepreneur or not. Okay. That defines a job-to-job mobility threshold. This is all kind of standard. Okay, what jobs, what outside offers do you accept? It defines also an entrepreneurship entry threshold. Okay, what's the maximum cost you're willing to pay to become an entrepreneur? Okay. Firms, they post vacancies. V to hire workers subject to two costs. One is a fixed cost, okay, and the second is a flow cost per vacancy posted. Okay. This fixed cost here is just going to allow me to generate exit. Okay, that's just standard. In models having a fixed cost. Stop paying that cost, you have to exit the market. That's the assumption. Okay. This is the recursion for the value of hiring to a firm. Let me move a little bit fast here. Defines a vacancy policy from a first order condition. Okay. Finally, I assume, as I alluded to before, that households own all firms through this mutual fund. Okay, so it's a simplifying assumption coming back to Romer's 1990 paper. It's going to avoid the age of the founder as a state in this problem. Okay, so that's the assumption of that. The mutual fund possesses some amount of capital that it rents out to firms in a competitive market. That factor in fixed supply is going to generate creative destruction, just as in any creative destruction model. Okay, so entry of new firms will price out the least productive incumbent firms. Okay, great. And then finally, there's a labor market that is standard, again, a Cobb-Douglas matching function.
Is there any evidence that the bulk of growth in the US comes from that type of?
Oh, no. The evidence suggests that only a fraction of it comes from it, and I'm going to estimate them all to only account for a fraction of that through endogenous growth here. Okay. So, yeah?
Just because the bulk of R&D in the US is done by accountants.
Sure. Sure. For sure. I'm going to try to pick a benchmark estimate in the model that suggests that about kind of half of growth is due to this kind of selection of firms. But yeah, there is a lot of kind of, uncertainty about what that number exactly is, but it's certainly not all of it in the model is coming from that. Okay. So we can show here that better matched individuals are less likely to move. Okay, that's kind of standard in these type of models because the opportunity cost of moving on is higher if you're better matched. Okay, you have to forsake your current match. Because of that, a better matched labor market discourages vacancy creation here. Okay, if individuals become better matched, they're less likely to move. That discourages firms from creating jobs. Okay? Second, again, better matched individuals are less likely to become entrepreneurs. Okay? Again, as we talked about, because the opportunity cost of becoming an entrepreneur is higher, you have to forsake your current job to become an entrepreneur. Okay? And for that reason, then again, holding everything else fixed, a better matched labor market discourages entrepreneurship. Okay? So it's less entrepreneurship. Okay? And finally, in terms of amplification then, so this is key, we can first show that the rate of obsolescence, the rate at which the economy kind of grows endogenously, is just a simple function of the aggregate entry rate. Okay? So that rate of obsolescence is the aggregate entry rate E over some parameter zeta here, which is the shape of the innovation distribution. Okay? This implies then that if for some reason entry declines, okay, that's going to lower the rate of obsolescence in this economy. Firms don't fall behind as fast as before, which in turn leads to less labor market mismatch. Okay? Individuals don't fall behind in the job ladder as fast as before, which then leads to even less entry. Okay? For these two reasons, that first, better matched individuals are less likely to enter entrepreneurship. The opportunity cost is higher. Second, it's more costly to hire workers in a better matched labor market. Okay? And that also dissuades entrepreneurship. Okay? So entry falls even more, and that amplifies. So to illustrate that, aging is going to have two direct effects, as we talked about here. It's going to first lead to better matching of individuals to firms, because older people are better matched. That's the first direct effect. Second, it's going to reduce entry, because older people are less likely to enter. So those are the direct effects, but those are not really what I'm after here. I'm after understanding the equilibrium effects of aging, and they are the following. When the labor market becomes better matched, it further reduces entry, okay, because it's less attractive to enter in a labor market where people are better matched. Okay, that's more costly to hiring. The entry rate falls for both of those reasons, the direct and indirect effect, slowing down the growth rate of the economy. When that happens, as we said, that's the same as this rate of obsolescence falling. It leads to the labor market becoming even better matched. Okay, individuals are not thrown out of matches as fast as before, which then further discourages entry, further reduces the growth rate, etc. So that's the key amplification mechanism here. Okay. Yeah?
Suppose the technology becomes better, so let's say firms and workers are better matched, not because of aging, just because of technology reason.
Yep.
How do you introduce that?
Yeah, no, that's true. One of these forces, too, could work and set this kind of amplification in motion. The reason I'm focusing on aging is that the cross-state variation really points to aging as being important. As long as that technology was not correlated with aging across states, then, you know, it seems like aging is an important factor. So that's the reason I focus on that. Okay. Yep?
Is there a monotonic relationship between aging and growth? Meaning, like, if you get younger, then you get more growth? I mean,
yeah. That's true. In the model, I think kind of it will be, but we'll talk about how there are two offsetting forces in the model in terms of welfare, at least. That there's a level effect and a growth effect, and these typically go in opposite directions. So what I'll have here is aging will have a negative effect on growth, but because, again, you have to destroy some old stuff to grow, it actually has a positive level effect on output. And it's not clear which of these are stronger. So in that sense, kind of, it's not clear that welfare will be higher or lower in this slower growing economy. Okay.
I know at least a couple of papers documenting a decline in entrepreneurship, so I guess that kind of goes along these lines.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't see a decline in R&D, right? You don't see a decline in. So how do you put these two things together?
That's true. Yeah, I think for the R&D thing, what papers in particular were you thinking of?
I'm thinking of just an object that can map your ideas. That I can map your
No,
ideas.
what papers show not a decline in R&D?
Oh, I just see it. I just go to NIPA and see it.
Okay. I have to look at those more carefully, I guess. R&D is clearly not kind of in the model here, so, I mean, or if you like, it's exogenous in the model, so it doesn't change over time. So in that sense, at least it's not inconsistent with this idea. I mean, incumbents grow at the same rate as before in the model too. Okay, but let me move on a little bit in terms of bringing the model to the data. Okay, so I'm going to use data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, as well as something called the BDS, so the Business Dynamic Statistics, for a late period. I'm going to calibrate the model to a late period, and I'm going to, in some sense, run the experiment in reverse. I'm going to make the population younger, and I'm going to evaluate the effect of making it younger. Okay? So I'm going to target life cycle dynamics of firms. I'm going to target aggregate moments of firm and worker dynamics, and as a validation, I'm going to show that the theory kind of predicts very well life cycle firm dynamics and life cycle worker dynamics. Yep.
This is a mechanism that happened clearly over there, the phasing through of the baby boom.
Absolutely, yes.
So there has to be some part where the baby boom is already out.
Yeah. So if you look, yeah.
Somewhere you could document how things are opening again.
Right.
Whether there's some age at which people open businesses, how does it change over the states, and none of that.
Right. Right. So in some sense, I perfectly agree that I'm doing a balanced growth path comparison. The reason is that solving it out of steady state is just very, very hard. So I have some attempts at approximating transition dynamics, and they suggest that they're reasonably fast. It's following recent work by Chad Jones, etc., that do a similar approach in their recent JP paper. But
you're not thinking of the baby boom.
right, yeah. So I'm thinking about a permanent change. The idea is that might approximate this economy fairly well, just because dynamism in the labor market is pretty fast, whereas these demographic changes are very slow. So when I do at least that approximation of the transition path, it looks like the economy converges pretty fast to kind of a new steady state. And the reason, again, I think is that many of these rates are very fast in the labor market. For instance, exit rates are high for new entrants. So in some sense, when a person is thinking about entering, he's thinking mostly about the age composition right now, and not that, say, 20 years down the road, because you should rationally expect to be out of the market in 20 years. So that's the kind of intuitively the idea for why I think it's fine to do the balanced growth path comparison. But it is a point well taken. It would be nice to solve the transition path fully. I agree. Yeah. Okay, great. So how am I doing on time now? Okay, great. So let me go a little bit fast here. I told you already what I'm going to do to try to get a sense of the magnitude of the effect of aging. So let me show you, instead of showing you some of these validation exercises, let me instead show you the effect of aging. Okay, so this is the predicted effect of aging in the model. Aging of the same magnitude as the US has seen generates a large decline in firm turnover, explaining a little bit over half of the decline we've seen in the data in the US over this period. Also for job reallocations, that's a broader measure of reallocation of jobs across US establishments. The model explains about 40% of that decline we've seen. Okay? And there's declines in both the entry and the exit rate according to the model, in line with what we've seen in the data. And finally, also income. Yeah.
You said that the model explained. There's something that just to say about it.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. That was terrible. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. That was awful terminology. What I mean to say is aging through the lens of the model explains between 40 and 50% of the declines. Yes. So through part of it is a direct effect, and I'll show you the decomposition in one slide. But a large chunk is also going to be this endogenous amplification.
That is going to predict some flattening also of the age profile of wages.
Wages are very hard to so it actually in the model they're pretty much on top of each other.
I thought that it was saying that because you're getting older, you have a higher level of effect, how much is higher.
Yeah, sure.
You have some steeper wage profiles, don't you?
No, not really in the model in response to aging. Certainly wages rise over the life cycle in the model, but in terms of changes in that in response to aging, it doesn't really change in the model much.
But it has to, because there is lower growth, isn't it?
No, not necessarily, but also, yeah, let me move on a little bit. Also, wages in general, kind of as we saw before, kind of to talk about that, you have to make a kind of ad hoc assumption on the timing of payments in these type of bargaining models. So that's why I don't really even focus much on wages, but yeah. Okay, so for worker dynamics.
On the previous slide, you said something about life cycle profiles.
Oh wait, yeah, those were all about the allocation. So life cycle profiles of mobility. Yeah. Okay. On the worker side, aging, again of the same magnitude as we've seen, explains a little under 40% of the decline in the employment-unemployment mobility rate, a little under half of the decline in job-to-job mobility. But in line with the data, it doesn't generate much of a decline in the unemployment-to-employment mobility rate, okay? Which is kind of, in some sense, this difference between the unemployment-to-employment and job-to-job mobility rate that we've seen in the data in the US over this period is kind of interesting, okay? Because typically if firms create fewer jobs, we would expect both of these hazard rates to go down. But they haven't really. In the US, it's primarily the job-to-job mobility rate that has fallen. The model matches that, and the explanation according to the model is that the labor market has become better matched. So more people kind of reject outside offers, and that drives this disproportionate decline in the job-to-job mobility rate that we've seen in the US. Okay? Okay. Finally, let me move the opposite direction and turn to growth. Okay. The model suggests that aging has reduced annual economic growth in the US by about 1/4 percentage point. Also, there's been a decline in the unemployment rate according to the model, in line again with the data. But as I talked or mentioned earlier, at the same time, it suggests an increase in some sense in the level of output. Okay? There's a positive level effect, but a negative growth effect in the model due to aging. Because when creative destruction slows, you're growing slower, but you don't have to destroy old stuff as fast. And it's not clear how quantitatively these will go, but it turns out that given my calibrated parameter values, net discounted output falls by about 4%. In response to aging. So we're worse off in this older economy, but there is certainly still a sense in which growth is slower, but there is a positive level effect. Okay? Okay, so to illustrate the mechanism, let me show you this. This is plotting the distribution of here young individuals in light blue and old individuals in dark blue over firm productivity. Okay? In here the young economy, so at a point in time. And as you can see, older people are better matched, okay? They've had more time to climb the ladder. As a result, when we make the economy older, we're gonna put more weight on the dark blue line. That's gonna be the direct effect of aging, reducing mobility rates, okay? Over and above that, there is an equilibrium shift, okay? So this is again plotting then the distribution of old individuals in the young economy, but then the distribution of old individuals in the old economy. So this is the equilibrium effect. Conditional on age, individuals become better matched. Okay, they're not falling behind in this job ladder as fast as before in this slower growing economy, so they're better matched conditional on age. This is the equilibrium effect that I mentioned. Okay? Okay, so that's the idea, and we can use that intuition to decompose the effects of aging into a direct effect. That's important. And again, it's going to match perfectly the direct effect you get from reading off the data by construction. That's going to generate about a 10% change in the entry rate, about a 7% change in job-to-job mobility. But over and above that, the model suggests a strong equilibrium effect that generates an additional almost 12% change in entry and a little over a 6% change in job-to-job mobility. So in a relative sense, this is, accounts for 54% of the predicted decline in the entry rate and 46% of the predicted decline in job-to-job mobility. Okay? So equilibrium effects are important here. And to give you a sense of where what leads me to infer large equilibrium effects of aging, well, it's something about that age conditional shift in how the labor market is matched, but it's also something about how the entry policy changes. Okay, so I'm plotting here that same shift in age conditional mismatch and overlaying it with the entry policy rate in light blue. Okay? So key is going to be the slope of this entry policy. As individuals become better matched, how less likely are they to attempt entrepreneurship?
So if you were to have innovations being made by corporations, so it doesn't cost much to the innovator to do that, how different would it be?
That's a good point. So as I mentioned, in some sense, there is a demand effect that people are less willing to become entrepreneurs. There's a supply effect because the pool of potential hires become older, and that also dissuades you from entering. Okay? And in a relative sense, they're going to be about 60% on the entry margin is going to be due to the demand effect, okay, that you have to forsake your previous job to become an entrepreneur, and about 40% is going to come from that supply effect that you're facing an older, better matched labor market. Okay? So for the entry margin, for the job-to-job mobility rate, say it's about switched. So about 65% is, Yep. Yeah, so the labor share falls marginally here. There is a decline, but it's very small. So the model certainly does not suggest that aging has led to the fall in the labor share that we've seen. But it also doesn't lead to an increase in the labor share. It's a modest decline in it.
Is it like all people that are better matched?
Yeah.
Should I think of labor share increase?
No, because the labor share is about what you're paid relative to your match quality. Okay? So you're better match, you're producing more, you're in higher productivity match, you get paid a little bit more too, that's true, and those move kind of almost one for one, so the labor share doesn't change much.
If you change, there is a paper by Emily Robert and Jake Short where you change slightly, which I think is if you change the wage setting protocol, and then I thought it was something about all the workforce have lower threat point and they get a lower fraction of
Yeah.
mechanically, that's going to generate a lower labor share.
Yeah, so that's possible. That's not happening in the model now. Wages are not allocative, so if you just change the wage setting protocol here, in some sense, it wouldn't have an effect as long as you don't kind of break this thing that wages are not allocative. But if you started thinking about kind of wage posting where they matter for the allocation, then certainly we're outside the realm of this model. So, but yeah, let me not, that's not in the model here. So let me instead, actually I managed to consolidate this, so I guess I'm actually almost done. So there's a bunch of kind of robustness exercises. One of is the one we talked about, trying to approximate transition dynamics. Again, I want to be clear that I'm making a steady state comparison here. And certainly I agree that in the US what we've seen is a slow transition dynamics as the baby boomers have gotten older. Okay, but also in terms of coming back to that a little bit, I actually just as a curiosity want to point out that if you look at projections going forward, we're going to stay approximately as old as we are right now for the next 100 or so years. Okay? So I'm focusing on the labor force 18 to 65, right? And that share that is 40 and older is going to stay approximately constant over time. So it's not like we're kind of immediately going to return back. It's rather the 80s was an exception with a lot of young people. But let me conclude. Aging, according to my analysis, explains between 40 and 50% of the declines in both entry, exit, and incumbent job relocation, as well as employment, unemployment, and job-to-job mobility that we've seen in the US. It generates only a modest decline in unemployment and employment mobility in line with what we've seen in the data over this period. Aging also has reduced annual economic growth by about 1/4 percentage point, and as we talked about at length, about half of these effects are due to equilibrium effects, an equilibrium kind of two-way interaction between labor market mismatch and incentives to enter and innovate. Okay? And in terms of policy, one thing that people have argued is that regulation, for instance, has led to this decline in dynamism that we've seen. My findings suggest something different, and as a result, they also suggest that kind of changing this will not necessarily bring back dynamism and growth. to the US economy. Rather, other type of policies could work better. One of them is immigration, of course, bringing in more young people. So it's, of course, quite kind of different from the policies we're seeing in the US right now. Okay? Oh, yeah. So again, I mentioned this earlier too. Certainly, my analysis doesn't suggest that aging is the only factor driving down dynamism. So again, coming back to regulation, certainly regulation could be still accounting for some of these declines. There is work suggesting that, in fact, something like occupational licensing could be a factor behind some of the declines we've seen. And finally, also for future work, it would obviously be very interesting to look across countries. I haven't done that. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks.